They told you that faith ends where reason begins. But what if I tell you that imagination itself is the bridge between the unseen and the visible? And that Neville Goddard once proved this through the quiet act of bringing his brother home from war without lifting a finger or writing a single letter. This is how it unfolds. In a time when the world trembled under the noise of conflict and mothers prayed through sleepless nights, Neville sat alone in his New York apartment and dared to assume that his brother Victor was already home, safe, laughing, and free. This is the turning point where logic gives way to a deeper knowing, for he did not plead with heaven nor ask for signs. He simply entered the inner scene and felt the joy of reunion so completely that it became real to him. This is how the invisible begins to move. For night after night, he imagined embracing his brother, smelling the sea air of Barbados, hearing familiar laughter echo through his mind as if distance and time had dissolved. This is where mystery takes form, because Neville taught that the imagination is not fantasy, but the creative power of God himself, clothed as human thought, waiting to be directed with conviction. This is how persistence takes shape, as he continued this imaginal act until it felt natural, until every doubt melted into the living certainty that what he saw within must unfold without. This is how reality bends. For weeks later, a telegram arrived. Victor had been honorably discharged and was sailing home exactly as Neville had envisioned. This is where astonishment meets understanding, for the family stood in awe not of coincidence, but of the quiet authority of one man's inner vision. This is how Neville revealed that imagination creates causation, that unseen acts of faith shape visible chains of events with surgical precision. This is how power moves in silence, when the inner picture is sustained longer than disbelief can whisper. This is where the ordinary mind ends and the creative mind awakens, realizing that no prayer is unanswered when the end is imagined and accepted as done. This is how belief becomes embodiment, as Neville's own words echo through time. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled and persist in that assumption. This is how a man discovered that the distance between desire and reality is not measured in miles or time, but in the intensity of one's conviction. This is how the unseen becomes obedient to vision, how thought becomes event, how inner feeling becomes outer fact. This is how life reveals its secret symmetry. What you dare to feel real within will one day take its shape without. This is where wonder becomes law, where imagination proves itself not as mere daydream, but as divine operation. This is how one brother's silent act of assumption turned into a miracle witnessed by many. This is how Neville's story transcends its time, showing that every mind holds this same authority. This is how you, too, are reminded that nothing is too great, too distant, or too impossible for the one who dares to imagine boldly. And this is how mystery becomes mastery, the moment you stop asking how and begin feeling it is done. Picture for a moment a man trapped in a circumstance that seemed unchangeable, a soldier bound by the strict laws of the military, yet inwardly free because he had discovered a law higher than any written by man. This is how the second great unfolding began, for Neville Goddard, drafted against his will during wartime, refused to accept bondage as his destiny. This is where vision overtakes circumstance, for in the stillness of his heart he remembered the teaching of his mentor Abdullah. Live as though you are where you want to be, and you will be compelled to go there. This is how defiance became creation, as Neville nightly entered the imaginal act of walking through the streets of New York, free, discharged, a civilian once more. This is how feeling becomes command, for he did not beg to be released. He simply assumed the tone of freedom and carried it in his being as though the matter were settled. This is where persistence rewrites fate, because the outer world, blind to his quiet rebellion, began to shape itself to his conviction. This is how the law moved invisibly, when a commanding officer who had once ignored him suddenly found the paperwork needed to secure his release. This is where impossibility collapsed. For within days Neville's discharge was granted, against every logical expectation. This is how a divine pattern unfolds, because what happened externally was only the echo of what he had already completed internally. This is how spirit expresses through form, bending laws, signatures, and decisions toward the image held in faith. This is where truth becomes visible, as Neville walked once again through the streets of his city, exactly as he had imagined. Proof that inner certainty molds outer circumstance. This is how the human mind discovers its divine inheritance, not by chance, but by disciplined imagination. This is where the unseen hand reveals itself, guiding the details with precision only belief can summon. This is how freedom is won, not through rebellion of force, but through obedience to the higher law of assumption. This is how Neville's story becomes a mirror, showing that no cage is too solid for one who has already walked free within. This is where courage meets creation, for he proved that feeling the wish fulfilled is the passport out of limitation. This is how mystery speaks softly, telling us that imagination is the key to every locked door. This is where the secret of liberty resides, in assuming that what you desire is already yours. This is how the tale of one soldier became the revelation of a universal power. This is how we learn that the truest discharge is from the army of fear and doubt. And this is how Neville's freedom became a timeless reminder that when imagination commands, reality must obey. Now consider this. A crowded hall in Los Angeles, the air thick with curiosity, as Neville Goddard stepped onto the stage and spoke not of miracles, but of law. A law that governed every hidden motion of life. This is how destiny pivoted for one woman seated in the back row, a skeptic weighed down by disappointment, who had come only because a friend insisted. This is how revelation hides in ordinary moments, for as Neville's voice filled the room, he said calmly, "Dare to assume it's already done, and the world will rearrange itself to make it so." This is how a seed was planted, though she did not yet know it, for his words lingered long after the applause faded and the crowd dispersed into the cool night. This is where faith begins as curiosity, when she returned home and, almost playfully, imagined holding the telegram she had longed for, an offer of work that seemed impossible to obtain. This is how imagination turns subtle into substance, for she repeated the act not with strain, but with conviction, falling asleep that night in the feeling that her problem was already solved. This is how the invisible responds, for the next morning she awoke to a knock on the door, a delivery boy holding the very telegram she had seen in her mind's eye. This is where astonishment becomes awakening, as she stood trembling, realizing she had stepped across the line between belief and knowing. This is how the unseen world proves itself through perfect timing, whispering that imagination is not illusion, but the architect of experience. This is how one moment of inward acceptance rewrote a chapter of her life, leaving her with no choice but to believe. This is where her doubt turned into a devotion to the law, for she wrote to Neville in awe, thanking him for giving her back the keys to her own destiny. This is how simplicity conceals power, because all she did was assume the end, without struggle, without fear, and the end came rushing toward her. This is how Neville's teachings transform lives, not by complexity, but by the elegance of direct faith in feeling. This is where every listener becomes a participant in creation, realizing that the words they hear become the images they live. This is how consciousness teaches through demonstration, not persuasion. This is where mystery meets proof, for her story spread through Neville's students as a living testimony to the law in action. This is how transformation always begins, with a single act of imagination accepted as truth. This is where the heart recognizes its divine authorship, and the world bows to that recognition. This is how a simple lecture became a doorway into the miraculous. And this is how Neville's words continue to echo through time, reminding every listener that the real lecture happens in silence, within the theater of their own mind. Suppose you discover that the walls surrounding you are not fixed realities, but reflections of inner conviction, and that one woman once proved this by imagining herself into an apartment that did not yet exist. This is how her story begins, in a crowded city where housing was scarce and landlords dismissed her with polite refusals that stung like glass. This is how she turned inward instead of yielding to despair, remembering Neville's words, "You are already where your imagination places you." This is where vision begins to breathe, as she stood in her tiny rented room each night, closing her eyes and walking through the corridors of the apartment she desired, feeling the wooden floor beneath her feet, touching invisible furniture, and smelling the faint scent of jasmine that she decided would greet her at the door. This is how imagination built its structure, unseen yet perfectly complete, until it felt more real to her than the four walls she occupied. This is where the outer world, obedient to the inner world, began its quiet rearrangement, aligning unseen people, timing, and opportunity into place. This is how mystery performs its craft. For one afternoon she overheard two strangers discussing an available flat on a street she adored, a listing not yet public. This is where faith turns into movement, as she followed the whisper of intuition, called the number, and discovered it was exactly as she had imagined, down to the faint jasmine scent that filled the hallway. This is how the impossible dissolves into precision. Because creation does not guess, it obeys the law of assumption. This is where she stood in awe, realizing she had walked there in consciousness long before her feet touched the ground. This is how imagination proves itself as the builder of bridges between desire and manifestation. This is where doubt loses its voice, silenced by the evidence of inner power. This is how the unseen becomes the seen, revealing that all things are made in secret before they appear in light. This is where her gratitude deepened into mastery, for she no longer begged life to change. She designed it inwardly first. This is how awareness becomes architecture, shaping reality one imaginal act at a time. This is where Neville's teaching found its living witness, a woman who turned air into structure and vision into address. This is how mystery merges with precision, showing that miracles are not accidents, but fulfillments of inner order. This is where beauty returns to the idea that the world is imagination outpictured. This is how her apartment became more than a home. It became proof that consciousness creates dwelling. And this is how we remember that every place we wish to be already exists within us, waiting for the moment we feel it real. Envision a world where effort bows to imagination, and doors once locked by credentials swing open at the command of belief. This is how Neville's friend, a man with no formal education and little experience, found himself in line for a position that demanded both. This is where limitation meets its match, for instead of bowing to logic, he remembered Neville's counsel: go to the end and dwell there. This is how transformation begins, not through anxious striving, but through silent assumption. This is where he began to construct his future from within, sitting quietly each night and imagining a handshake with the company's director, hearing the words, "Congratulations, you're hired," echoing with such clarity it felt tangible. This is how the invisible starts to shape the visible, because emotion wrapped around an idea gives it weight in the unseen. This is where the rational mind protests, but faith ignores argument and continues the inner act until it becomes second nature. This is how life, moved by unseen currents, began to conspire. An unexpected meeting, a casual conversation, and a recommendation from a man he barely knew. This is where imagination arranges its chessboard, moving unseen pieces until the picture matches the vision. This is how opportunity often disguises itself as coincidence, though nothing is truly accidental in the world of consciousness. This is where he received the call, his voice steady though his heart raced. He was offered the position that once seemed unreachable. This is how law fulfills itself quietly, with no thunder or spectacle, just the perfect unfolding of assumed reality. This is where gratitude becomes understanding, as he realized it was not luck, but law responding to conviction. This is how a man learns that qualifications of the mind matter less than qualifications of faith. This is where the script of life is rewritten by imagination's hand, line by line, until outer facts mirror inner feeling. This is how belief defies hierarchy, bending systems toward the one who knows the end is already secured. This is where Neville's wisdom becomes alive, when someone dares to see themselves as already chosen, already celebrated, already capable. This is how the unseen world rewards certainty, not effort alone. This is where the mystery of manifestation loses its mystery, revealing itself as divine order obeying inner assumption. This is how Neville's friend became living proof that the world responds to imagination's confidence, not circumstance's permission. And this is how we are reminded that destiny does not ask for permission, it waits for imagination to command. Think of the moment when something ordinary turns sacred, when a simple envelope becomes the handwriting of the unseen, And that is how this story unfolds. A story Neville often told to show how imagination orchestrates the smallest details with breathtaking precision. This is how it begins, with a woman burdened by financial strain who decided after one of Neville's lectures to test the law rather than merely admire it. This is where her determination became faith, for she went home and imagined holding a thick envelope addressed to her, feeling its texture, hearing the paper rustle, and sensing the weight of a check inside. This is how imagination begins its quiet craftsmanship, because she persisted in that feeling each night before sleep until it became more real than her worry. This is where mystery entered through natural means, for a few days later as she checked her mail, there it was. An envelope bearing her name, its seal unbroken, but its presence radiating uncanny familiarity. This is how belief meets confirmation, for inside was a letter from an old employer apologizing for an accounting error and enclosing a payment that exceeded even what she had imagined. This is where astonishment melted into understanding, as she realized the exact scene she had conjured in her mind had replayed itself in physical form. This is how the invisible writes to the visible, using matter and motion to deliver proof of unseen cause. This is where logic stands silent, unable to explain how imagination could arrange such timing and precision. This is how Neville's words ring with authority. Imagination creates reality, not some of it, all of it. This is where her fear of lack dissolved forever, replaced by a serene confidence that thought, when felt, becomes substance. This is how she began to understand that the world is a mirror reflecting the tone of one's inner speech. This is where she stopped asking when and started declaring now. This is how the law responds, not to time, but to conviction held long enough to harden into fact. This is where faith becomes proof, not through effort, but through sustained inner certainty. This is how the ordinary envelope became a sacred token of divine order in motion. This is where imagination unveiled itself as the author of circumstance, the unseen hand that scripts coincidence. This is how Neville's teaching stepped out of theory into demonstration, reminding every student that what is done within will echo without. This is where her story ends, but yours begins, because every envelope, every letter, every event is already written by the one who dares to imagine. And this is how reality itself becomes correspondence between belief and manifestation, forever sealed by the words, "It is done." Ask yourself what happens when a mother refuses to accept limitation and steps into the boundless power of imagination. And that is exactly how the story begins. A woman confronted with the illness of her young son, doctors shaking their heads, prognosis grim, and yet her heart unyielding. This is where despair meets defiance. For instead of pleading with the world, she entered the inner room of vision and imagined her son whole, laughing, running, and completely restored. This is how imagination transcends medicine, not as a substitute, but as the origin of all that appears in form. This is where persistence takes root, as she repeated the scene each night, feeling every heartbeat of vitality, every color of health surrounding him as though it were tangible. This is how the unseen world bends, because the mother's belief became a living command, unseen forces aligning themselves to the image she held. This is where the miraculous unfolds quietly, without spectacle, for within days, her son's condition began to reverse in ways the doctors could not explain. This is how proof of law manifests, as the illness that had once dominated the household dissolved, leaving only laughter and light. This is where patience becomes power, for she never wavered, never doubted, never sought validation outside the reality she imagined. This is how Neville's teaching finds flesh, showing that life responds first to feeling, then to thought, and finally to circumstance. This is where faith and imagination converge, creating a bridge between the invisible and the visible, between prayer and proof. This is how every small gesture of assumption gathers momentum until it overwhelms opposing facts. This is where reality is neither cruel nor random, it is obedient to the inner world held as true. This is how a mother discovered mastery, not by force, but by assuming the end, persisting until it was no longer unseen. This is where mystery becomes law, as healing manifests as effortlessly as the sun rises. This is how courage whispers to the heart, saying, "You are the creator, you are the healer." This is where love amplifies imagination, giving it clarity, direction, and irrevocable weight. This is how the boy, restored, became a living testament to the law of assumption in action. This is where the ordinary transforms into extraordinary, showing that consciousness is the source of all form. This is how Neville's students learn the profound truth. No outer circumstance can override inner certainty. And this is how a mother's quiet vision reshaped destiny, leaving a story of healing that echoes through time, inviting all who listen to step boldly into the power within. Envision a moment when a man sees not with his eyes, but with the entire weight of consciousness. And that is where Neville Goddard's own revelation of the promise begins. A vision so vivid it transcended time, space, and logic. This is how it unfolded, in the quiet of his room, as he closed his eyes and felt the world dissolve around him, leaving only the living essence of divine fulfillment. This is where imagination became prophecy, for he did not merely picture events, he inhabited their reality fully, feeling the joy, peace, and abundance as though they were tangible. This is how the unseen reveals itself, speaking in symbols, sensations, and inner certainties that defy ordinary explanation. This is where the promise of life, perfect, whole, and eternal, was shown to him not as theory but as experience, proving that consciousness is the soil from which every reality sprouts. This is how mystery reveals its face, for he saw himself living the life of the fulfilled, every desire satisfied, every fear dissolved, as though the end had always existed. This is where his heart understood that the world is molded not by external circumstance, but by the persistent assumption of the desired state. This is how vision informs action, though the action is internal first, creating an invisible structure that eventually hardens into outer fact. This is where time bends, because past and future merge into the eternal now of felt reality. This is how Neville became both witness and participant in the miracle, seeing that the promise is not given to those who wait, but to those who assume. This is where faith takes flesh, no longer a concept, but a living pulse that animates every thought and feeling. This is how the ordinary mind glimpses the extraordinary, realizing that what appears miraculous is only natural when the law is known and applied. This is where he discovered that every life is a canvas, and imagination is the brush painting events before they appear in the world. This is how consciousness dances with reality, orchestrating outcomes in perfect rhythm with inner certainty. This is where doubt fades, replaced by the serene knowledge that every desire has already been fulfilled in the unseen. This is how Neville's vision became teaching, proof, and inspiration all at once. This is where the soul recognizes itself as the eternal creator, not subject to fate, but the author of destiny. This is how the invisible promises reveal their presence in vivid clarity. This is where every student learns that seeing is not believing, feeling is believing, and imagining is creating. And this is how Neville's own experience of the promise remains a beacon. A reminder that the end is always present, waiting to be acknowledged, inhabited, and made manifest. Can you imagine a man standing before impossibility and treating it as inevitable? A man who knew nothing of chance, yet everything of feeling? This is how it began, ordinary in appearance, yet extraordinary in principle, as he sat quietly each evening, imagining the numbers drawn, hearing them called aloud, feeling the thrill of victory as if it were already his. This is where imagination and emotion fuse, creating a reality too precise to be coincidence. This is how he persisted, not with doubt or calculation, but with unwavering conviction that the unseen follows the felt experience. This is where the universe begins to orchestrate, aligning strangers, tickets, and timing into perfect harmony with the vision held in mind. This is how the improbable becomes inevitable, as the night of the drawing arrived and each number announced matched exactly the scene he had rehearsed inwardly. This is where astonishment meets revelation, for those around him saw luck, but he knew law, the law that obedience to feeling bends reality. This is how Neville's teaching manifests in living proof. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled and persist until fact follows. This is where reality dances to the rhythm of consciousness, making the inner act the author of outer circumstance. This is how patience and persistence intertwine, for the vision had been cultivated silently over days until belief hardened into certainty. This is where external conditions, seemingly random, collapse into orderly submission to imagination's command. This is how excitement becomes quiet assurance, as the man's triumph was no accident, but the inevitable conclusion of his inner conviction. This is where mystery becomes law, revealing that chance is only law misunderstood. This is how his story inspires, showing that visible scarcity has no power over felt abundance. This is where thought, feeling, and vision converge, bending probability to certainty. This is how the mind learns that reality mirrors only what it assumes with feeling. This is where disbelief fades before the certainty of inner knowledge. This is how one ordinary man, by imagining wealth as real, became living proof that the unseen is obedient. This is where imagination is crowned sovereign over circumstance, demonstrating that miracles are only delayed assumptions realized. And this is how the lottery was not won by chance, but by the disciplined, unwavering act of feeling what is already true, leaving a story that whispers to all, your reality bends to the conviction you embody. Consider the power of stepping into yesterday and rewriting it, not as fantasy, but as a deliberate act of creation. And that is how this story begins. A man haunted by a failure that seemed to define him, replaying it endlessly, until Neville's teaching offered a radical alternative. This is where the ordinary mind meets the extraordinary, for he was instructed to close his eyes, see the scene exactly as he wished it had occurred, and feel the resolution fully realized, as though it were always true. This is how imagination became a tool of transformation, not escape, bending the timeline of his life toward the desired end. This is where persistence and detail merged, for he returned to the scene nightly, adjusting dialogue, expressions, and outcomes, until the memory itself felt rewritten. This is how the unseen world responds, aligning people, circumstances, and opportunities to reflect the newly assumed past. This is where outer events, once rigid, began to soften, as old mistakes were mirrored by new successes in the present. This is how Neville's principle of revision proved itself, showing that the past is not fixed but fluid, molded by inner vision. This is where fear and regret dissolve, replaced by empowerment and certainty. This is how the man began to notice subtle shifts, conversations, chance encounters, and outcomes aligning perfectly with his revised inner narrative. This is where law overrides habit, for the world must conform to the assumption firmly held. This is how a single imaginal act, faithfully repeated, can ripple through time, changing relationships, careers, and personal destiny. This is where disbelief must bow, as he watched impossibilities yield to imagined truth. This is how the act of revising the past becomes a gateway to freedom, because consciousness alone dictates experience. This is where mastery of feeling overtakes mastery of circumstance, proving the unseen governs the seen. This is how Neville's story became a living laboratory of the mind's authority, showing that no external event is beyond correction. This is where the miracle is quiet but absolute, unfolding with the precision of law. This is how his future, once threatened by error, blossomed into opportunity. This is where imagination not only predicts but engineers reality, leaving a record of transformation impossible to ignore. This is how one man's nighttime act of revision reshaped his entire life. And this is how we learn that the past is merely clay, waiting for the hands of belief to sculpt it into the future we desire. Now consider the quiet desperation of a woman whose marriage teetered on the brink. Hearts once entwined, now distanced by misunderstanding, silence, and resentment. And yet her story unfolds not through confrontation, but through the power of inner vision. This is where she learned from Neville Goddard that the end already exists, and by feeling it real, she could invite it into manifestation. This is how she began to close her eyes each night and imagine the warmth of conversation returning, laughter spilling across rooms, and the embrace of her husband as though no separation had ever existed. This is where patience becomes creation, for she did not rush or demand, but allowed the inner scene to grow vivid, detailed, and compelling, until it overshadowed all outer evidence. This is how the unseen world conspires with faith. For slowly the husband's behavior began to mirror the harmony she assumed. This is where reconciliation, once improbable, becomes inevitable, as moments of understanding, small gestures, and spontaneous kindness flowed effortlessly into their daily lives. This is how Neville's law of assumption proves itself, showing that outer reality bends to the images held in the mind and heart. This is where doubt may whisper, but she persisted, feeling the marriage whole before any external signs appeared. This is how imagination transcends conflict, reshaping relationships without confrontation or coercion. This is where her confidence became quiet authority, silently steering events toward the resolution she had already accepted as true. This is how the mundane world begins to align with inner certainty, delivering scenarios that reflect the assumed ending. This is where subtle miracles occur, words spoken, timing of encounters, gestures perfectly timed, all guided by unseen orchestration. This is how the law works without drama, proving that persistence in the felt reality is more potent than any argument or plea. This is where her transformation inspired others, showing that love, when imagined and felt fully, has the power to heal. This is how imagination becomes a bridge, reconnecting hearts and dissolving the illusion of separation. This is where the once fragile bond grew resilient, restored by unseen forces responding to conviction. This is how Neville's teachings illuminate the profound truth. The inner world shapes the outer, and harmony begins in consciousness. This is where faith becomes demonstration, and demonstration becomes undeniable proof. This is how one woman, through imagination alone, rebuilt a life that had seemed lost. And this is how love, when held as already fulfilled, manifests in the world with effortless inevitability. Picture for a moment a man weighed down by debts and endless worries, a businessman whose world seemed dictated by failure, yet who discovered a secret no ledger could record, the silent power of imagination. This is how he began, closing his office door each evening, sitting in stillness, and seeing himself already prosperous, feeling the satisfaction, respect, and ease of a life fully successful. This is where patience meets strategy, for he did not chase clients or scramble for deals. He allowed the inner vision to grow, vibrant and unshakable, until it eclipsed all outer obstacles. This is how the unseen began to work. As opportunities arrived with perfect timing, conversations unfolded with precision, and partnerships materialized almost magically. This is where Neville's law of assumption reveals its subtlety, showing that when one feels the end fulfilled, the world bends quietly to reflect it. This is how doubt was conquered, for he persisted in the inner act even when all evidence suggested failure. This is where mystery meets method, because his inner certainty orchestrated events with flawless accuracy. This is how the business grew, not by frantic action, but by the momentum of a consciousness aligned with success. This is where inspiration replaces struggle, for every client, meeting, and opportunity became a mirror of his assumed reality. This is how imagination, repeated and felt with conviction, transforms scarcity into abundance. This is where the ordinary mind might see luck, but the visionary recognizes law at work. This is how a quiet room and focused thought became a laboratory for creating reality. This is where his confidence radiated outward, influencing colleagues, competitors, and circumstances without a single word. This is how unseen currents shape the scene, bending timelines, people, and events toward one's inner assumption. This is where persistence and imagination merge, creating a momentum impossible to stop. This is how the businessman's inner stillness became the engine of wealth and influence. This is where external proof finally aligns with inner knowing, leaving no room for doubt. This is how Neville's teaching shines. The end is assumed, and the outer world conforms. This is where a life once constrained by circumstance becomes expansive and free. And this is how imagination, silent yet potent, transformed a struggling businessman into a living testament to the law of assumption. Envision a young man wandering through the streets of New York, seeking meaning, yet unaware that destiny had already arranged an encounter that would alter the course of his life forever. This is how Neville Goddard met Abdullah, a mysterious teacher whose presence radiated quiet authority and whose words carried the weight of unseen wisdom. This is where curiosity meets destiny. For Abdullah did not preach, he revealed. Consciousness is the only reality, and imagination shapes all that appears in time and space. This is how Neville learned that the world is a mirror, reflecting the beliefs held within, and that every circumstance obeys the unseen law of assumption. This is where teaching becomes revelation, for each conversation was a living demonstration. guiding Neville to inhabit the state of the fulfilled wish before it manifests. This is how the unseen becomes palpable, as he began to practice, feel, and see life from the vantage of his assumed desires. This is where faith transforms into mastery, for the techniques Abdullah revealed were not theoretical, they were blueprints for shaping reality itself. This is how mentorship becomes alchemy, turning ordinary perception into creative authority. This is where Neville's mind expanded, realizing that imagination is God within, the ultimate architect of all form. This is how persistence in feeling takes precedence over outward effort, teaching him that patience is an active force, not idle waiting. This is where ordinary life bends to the unseen, as he began to test the principles, witnessing their precision and inevitability. This is how mystery reveals itself, not in spectacle, but in the quiet unfolding of law obeyed. This is where vision and action merge, for imagination without feeling is empty, and feeling without imagination is directionless. This is how Neville's encounter shaped decades of teaching, providing proof that consciousness governs all experience. This is where inner certainty eclipses external circumstance, leaving only the unfolding of desired reality. This is how understanding becomes living knowledge, not a book, not a lecture, but a transformation of being. This is where trust in unseen forces becomes second nature, guiding choices, relationships, and opportunities with invisible hands. This is how a single meeting with a mystic unlocked a universe of creative power within a young man. This is where Neville realized that mastery is not sought, but recognized within. And this is how Abdullah's wisdom became the cornerstone of Neville Goddard's life, forever proving that reality bows to the imagination imbued with conviction. Now consider a journey that begins not with money or planning, but entirely within the mind. And that is how Neville's story unfolds, as he imagined himself walking along sunlit streets in Barbados, feeling the warm breeze, hearing the gentle waves, and sensing the freedom of being exactly where he wished. This is where imagination becomes the precursor to reality, for he did not yet own a ticket, nor make reservations, yet the feeling of being there was complete and undeniable. This is how the unseen world aligns with inner certainty, orchestrating circumstances to match the vivid picture held within. This is where timing, coincidence, and opportunity converge, because within days he received an unexpected invitation and travel arrangements that made the trip possible without cost. This is how belief bends logistics, proving that the outer world is obedient to the inner state. This is where mystery becomes everyday magic, as people, events, and even finances moved into perfect harmony with his imagined scene. This is how he felt the cobblestone beneath his feet before the journey began, experiencing the streets, markets, and rhythm of life as if already there. This is where inner experience precedes outer manifestation, leaving no doubt that reality is the echo of imagination. This is how Neville's own life demonstrates that what is assumed and felt as true will inevitably find expression. This is where patience, focus, and feeling meet, producing outcomes that defy conventional expectation. This is how the world conspires with vision, delivering solutions quietly, efficiently, and without struggle. This is where anticipation transforms into certainty, for he knew that nothing external could prevent the fulfillment of the imaginal act. This is how his heart learned the supreme law. See it, feel it, persist, and it must be. This is where ordinary travel becomes an extraordinary testament to the power of consciousness. This is how events that seemed dependent on money or planning were effortlessly arranged by unseen forces. This is where imagination proves itself as the blueprint of reality and feeling as the hammer that shapes it. This is how he returned from Barbados not just refreshed, but affirmed in the absolute authority of inner vision. This is where joy and gratitude deepen understanding, showing that all material needs respond to consciousness first. This is how Neville's story teaches that travel, opportunity, and abundance flow naturally when assumed as already experienced. And this is how a trip that cost nothing in dollars cost everything in belief, leaving a living lesson in the obedience of reality to imagination. Envision a woman walking through a rundown street, seeing peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, and vacant lots. Yet inwardly she refused to accept decay as final. And that is where her story begins. This is where imagination becomes activism, For each night she closed her eyes and pictured the neighborhood alive. Children laughing in clean yards, gardens blooming, neighbors greeting one another with warmth and respect. This is how persistence in vision bends the outer world. For her repeated inner act began to influence her energy, interactions, and the subtle currents of the community. This is where the unseen organizes reality, bringing allies, resources, and unexpected opportunities into alignment with the imagined scene. This is how the streets she walked daily began to transform, as neighbors were inspired to repair homes, plant flowers, and engage with one another in ways that mirrored her inner vision. This is where law and imagination converge, proving that sustained feeling and assumption can reshape even public reality. This is how small acts, guided by the certainty of inner vision, ripple outward with profound effect. This is where mystery manifests through timing, coincidences, and perfect arrangements that appear effortless, yet follow the blueprint of consciousness. This is how doubt is silenced, as day by day, the once bleak neighborhood became vibrant and welcoming. This is where Neville's principle of living in the end becomes tangible, showing that the world conforms to the images we persist in. This is how personal responsibility for consciousness extends to the collective, influencing circumstances beyond one's immediate control. This is where imagination becomes the architect of society, proving that inner assumptions shape outer culture. This is how neighbors, unknowingly, became instruments of her vision, responding to the energy she radiated. This is where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, for what began as a mental picture transformed into streets filled with life, beauty, and connection. This is how persistence in imagining the fulfilled state creates inevitable manifestation. This is where reality is obedient to inner certainty, aligning people, resources, and events seamlessly. This is how joy and gratitude accelerate transformation, reinforcing the unseen order behind visible change. This is where the law of assumption becomes practical, showing that nothing external resists a sustained inner conviction. This is how a single woman's imagination reshaped her environment, leaving a living testament to creative power. And this is how consciousness proves that neighborhoods, like lives, bend in perfect harmony with the visions we embrace and persist in. Ask yourself what happens when a man refuses to entertain doubt, holding steadfastly to a vision that seems impossible. And that is where this story begins. A man surrounded by skepticism, failures, and repeated setbacks, yet internally unwavering in the certainty of his goal. This is where persistence in assumption becomes mastery. For each day he rehearsed the scene of his dream already accomplished, feeling the joy, the respect, and the satisfaction as though it were present. This is how imagination assumes authority over circumstance, bending reality to reflect the state maintained within. This is where the unseen begins its work, orchestrating people, timing, and events to fulfill what was already complete in consciousness. This is how the mind transcends fear, replacing uncertainty with unshakable knowing. This is where invisible forces align with belief, producing opportunities and solutions that defy ordinary expectation. This is how he navigated obstacles, not by struggle, but by holding the end as real, letting circumstances adjust themselves to his conviction. This is where Neville's law of assumption demonstrates its power. What is assumed to be true, regardless of present evidence, must manifest. This is how he noticed synchronicities multiplying, as meetings, offers, and encounters aligned perfectly with his inner scene. This is where doubt attempts entry, only to be repelled by the strength of persistent feeling. This is how miracles take shape quietly, unfolding through ordinary means orchestrated by the extraordinary certainty within. This is where he learned that belief, when maintained long enough, becomes fact, and imagination becomes the blueprint of reality. This is how the invisible guides visible outcomes, proving that persistence in inner truth is the ultimate power. This is where ordinary moments transform into milestones, each event a testament to unseen orchestration. This is how he cultivated joy in advance, knowing the end was already written in the language of consciousness. This is where faith becomes creative action, not an effort, but an unwavering assumption. This is how the mind discovers its sovereignty over circumstance, bending every challenge to align with vision. This is where Neville's teaching comes alive. Reality obeys the conviction we entertain without falter. This is how the impossible dissolves before sustained belief, leaving only manifestation. And this is how a man, by refusing to doubt, became a living example that the dream already exists within, waiting only to be recognized and embraced. Picture for a moment a young woman longing for a home that seemed beyond reach, small income, high rent, and endless obstacle between her and her dream. Yet she chose not to focus on lack, but on the vivid image of living in her perfect space. This is where imagination takes the lead. For each night she sat quietly, feeling the walls painted in colors she loved, the sunlight spilling through windows, and the furniture arranged just as she desired. This is how Neville's principle of assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled became her practice, shaping her perception until the inner scene felt undeniably real. This is where the unseen began to orchestrate, arranging opportunities, coincidences, and connections to match her imagined reality. This is how patience and persistence in inner vision bend the outer world, as days later she discovered a rental that matched her inner picture down to the smallest detail. This is where joy and certainty merge, for she recognized the alignment of thought and circumstance as law in action. This is how doubt gradually lost its grip, replaced by the unshakable knowing that imagination governs reality. This is where the mundane becomes extraordinary, as landlords, paperwork, and timing all cooperated seamlessly with her inner assumption. This is how the feeling of already having transforms waiting into fulfillment, dissolving anxiety and impatience. This is where vision guides action without force, allowing life to respond naturally to sustained inner belief. This is how the home, once a distant hope, became tangible proof of imagination's authority. This is where every detail, from the creak of the floorboards to the aroma in the kitchen, mirrored her nightly inner rehearsals. This is how Neville's teaching proves itself repeatedly. The outer world is a reflection of inner reality. This is where gratitude amplifies manifestation, reinforcing alignment between desire and experience. This is how persistence in feeling turns possibility into inevitability, no matter how impossible it appears at first. This is where the young woman learned to trust the unseen, letting her mind be the architect of her life. This is how circumstances bend effortlessly to inner certainty when maintained with feeling and faith. This is where imagination becomes a tangible tool, crafting reality in accordance with vision. This is how a simple practice of nightly assumption reshaped her environment, her life, and her confidence. And this is how one young woman's commitment to feeling her wish fulfilled became living evidence that reality is obedient to imagination imbued with certainty. Consider the moment when doors slam shut, opportunities vanish, and the world seems determined to deny you. And yet that is precisely where Neville's story of transformation begins. Facing repeated rejection in both career and relationships, yet refusing to accept it as permanent. This is where imagination becomes strategy, for he closed his eyes and assumed the end he desired, feeling acceptance, recognition, and success as though it were already accomplished. This is how persistence in inner vision bends circumstance, silently reshaping what appears impossible into achievable reality. This is where the unseen begins its orchestration, aligning people, timing, and events to match the scene already held within. This is how rejection dissolves in the presence of conviction, replaced by doors opening in ways never anticipated. This is where Neville's law of assumption demonstrates its precision. What is felt as real internally must manifest externally. This is how patience becomes power, as he persisted in imagining triumph, undeterred by apparent obstacles. This is where ordinary interactions transform, as colleagues, friends, and strangers respond to the energy of assumed success. This is how mystery and law converge, proving that outer refusal is no match for inner certainty. This is where he discovered that every denial is a precursor to alignment with what is imagined. This is how life rearranges itself quietly, orchestrating results that match the unwavering feeling of fulfillment. This is where faith becomes creative action, not through effort, but through sustained assumption. This is how rejection became a catalyst for greater opportunity, revealing pathways previously unseen. This is where the ordinary mind would falter, but imagination persists, shaping reality with meticulous accuracy. This is how Neville's teaching finds proof, showing that inner conviction commands outer circumstances. This is where every closed door is merely a redirect toward the inevitable manifestation of desire. This is how he experienced the transformation of despair into empowerment, witnessing the unseen law in action. This is where consistency of vision triumphs over temporary setbacks, making what is assumed unavoidable. This is how opportunity, once denied, returned amplified and complete. And this is how Neville's mastery turned rejection into a living lesson. That reality bends to imagination held with unwavering certainty. Now imagine a man burdened by debt, anxiety pressing down like a heavy weight, and yet he refused to see scarcity as final, stepping instead into the realm of imagination to claim what he needed. This is where Neville's teaching became his guide. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and reality will align to reflect it. This is how he closed his eyes each night, envisioning the exact amount of money in his hands, feeling the relief, joy, and security as though it were already true. This is where persistence becomes power, where he repeated the act with unwavering conviction until doubt could no longer enter. This is how the unseen orchestrates events, arranging unexpected payments, gifts, or opportunities to converge perfectly with the inner seen. This is where miracles appear as natural outcomes, as a check arrived the next day from an old client, covering not just a portion, but the entire sum he had imagined. This is how belief becomes evidence, proving the law of assumption is impartial and absolute. This is where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, showing that the mind's certainty is stronger than any external obstacle. This is how his confidence grew, no longer anchored in circumstance, but in the power of felt reality. This is where imagination writes the script, and the world performs it with precision. This is how fear of lack dissolved, replaced by the serene knowledge that supply responds to inner conviction. This is where timing, method, and human cooperation converge effortlessly, orchestrated by unseen intelligence responding to feeling. This is how Neville's law reveals itself through exactitude, not randomness. This is where the man realized he need not manipulate the outer world, only master his inner state. This is how joy and gratitude amplified manifestation, strengthening the alignment between inner desire and outer result. This is where the impossible became inevitable, as the imagined sum appeared exactly as rehearsed. This is how reality bends to the sustained assumption of fulfillment. This is where the law of imagination transforms anxiety into empowerment, scarcity into abundance. This is how one act of disciplined feeling reshaped a life overnight. And this is how Neville's teaching provides living proof that money, like all desires, responds with perfect obedience to the imagination imbued with certainty. Envision a young student, curious yet skeptical, wandering through the classrooms of thought, textbooks in hand, questions in mind, and yet unaware that the greatest lesson awaited, not in print, but in consciousness itself. This is where Neville's teaching revealed its ultimate secret. Life is imagination, and everything experienced is a reflection of the states we assume within. This is how the student began to experiment, closing his eyes each night to live fully in the scenes he desired. Academic success, personal confidence, and joy realized as if already true. This is where persistence became discovery, for he noticed subtle shifts, teachers responding differently, classmates aligning in support, opportunities arising unexpectedly, all echoing his inner assumption. This is how the invisible works quietly, orchestrating the visible world in perfect harmony with sustained feeling. This is where belief transforms into knowing, and knowing into fact, as the student realized that imagination precedes experience. This is how doubts lost their power, replaced by curiosity and the disciplined act of assuming the end already fulfilled. This is where the mundane tasks of study, interaction, and growth became vessels for demonstrating law in action. This is how imagination becomes the architect of destiny, designing outcomes that match the inner vision. This is where failure dissolves, for mistakes are merely temporary illusions that vanish when the end is assumed as complete. This is how the student learned that every circumstance, relationship, and opportunity is obedient to consciousness. This is where patience is an active force, not idle waiting, aligning unseen forces with inner certainty. This is how joy, gratitude, and confidence accelerate manifestation, reinforcing the power of assumed reality. This is where the student realized he is not subject to life, but creator of it, crafting experience moment by moment. This is how ordinary moments became extraordinary laboratories for learning, practice, and proof. This is where imagination's authority becomes undeniable, as outer reality mirrors inner conviction flawlessly. This is how Neville's teaching transforms skepticism into mastery, theory into evidence, and vision into life. This is where life itself becomes a canvas, consciousness the brush, and imagination the guiding hand. This is how one student's journey crystallized into a universal truth. Reality is nothing more than imagination realized. And this is how the story concludes, leaving every listener with the eternal lesson that the world bends to the certainty, feeling, and assumption of the mind, forever proving that we are, each of us, the artists of our own existence.